It's time for some collective wisdom, a podcast advancing the cannabis revolution, one conversation at a time. We all benefit from sharing knowledge and experiences. So if you want to learn about the business of cannabis from those in the trenches, you've come to the right place. Here's your host, Lisa Tollner, co-founder of SensiChew.
Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Ryan Douglas, and he has an extensive background in cultivation. He's the author of From Seed to Success, How to Launch a Great Cannabis Cultivation Business in Record Time. He has accumulated an incredible level of knowledge and experience when it comes to cannabis cultivation. He has recently started his own cannabis consulting services company, Ryan Douglas Cultivation, LLC. He's worked with commercial cultivation and horticulture for over 23 years, and he has become a specialist in legal cannabis startups. He was a former master grower at Tweed, Canada's largest licensed producer of legal cannabis, and the flagship subsidiary, Canopy Growth Corporation. And Ryan was crucial to Tweed's early success. He'd helped design their production facility, selected the genetics, hired and trained staff, and during that time produced over 70,000 plants and 6 tons of dry cannabis. So an impressive background, to say the least. So prior to that, Ryan spent 15 years in commercial greenhouse, ornamental and edible crops, and grew up to 600,000 plants annually. So without further ado, Ryan Douglas, welcome to Collective Wisdom.
Well, thanks for having me on, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's dive right in. Your book is coming at a pivotal time. The cannabis industry, at least in North America, has been completing its second full year of compliance and legal cannabis for many states. Cultivation, of course, is at the core of everything that happens in cannabis. And more cultivation is continuing to grow and come online. Tell us about your book and what the motivation of producing this book was for you.
So basically, I wrote my book to create really a guide for anyone from any industry to enter cannabis and launch a cultivation business quickly and efficiently and successfully. So in the last 4 years of working as an international cannabis consultant, what I found is that when I went to visit potential clients to see their cultivation sites, when they called me to have a look at their problems, it was very seldom the problem was due to a technical issue like the wrong kind of fertilizer or the wrong kind of grow lights. Almost 9 times out of 10, the problem was related to decisions that were made early on in the planning phase of the business. And so what I wanted to do was create a book that could show anybody from any industry really step by step how to plan and prepare and design and launch and expand a commercial cultivation business.
So when you mention planning, it would seem that planning is probably one of the core components that gets missed. Is it just so multifaceted that it becomes a challenge, or is it just improper plans are set forth?
Sure. So when we think about planning, that involves everything from facility design to selection of an experienced head grower to creating realistic expectations, both for the government and for investors. So as an example, I spent the last 4 years living and consulting in Colombia, South America. And so as that industry was taking off, what I found was that a lot of people that owned land within their family had applied for a license and decided that they would start growing there. And so just because land is available doesn't mean it's an appropriate region to start growing. So if you apply for a cannabis cultivation license and your family owns land in the middle of nowhere and you can't access water, there's no electrical infrastructure, and there's no roads to bring equipment to build a greenhouse, that's a massive oversight. And so it would be much less expensive simply to select a different piece of land than to try to make that work. So that's just one example of an oversight made during the planning process that oftentimes clients call me to try to fix. And that's exactly the type of oversight I'm trying to help newcomers to the industry avoid by really laying out in plain language how we plan and design the launch of one of these kind of businesses.
So that's a pretty significant example of foresight just with raw land. Do you find that for future growers in the United States, ones where infrastructure isn't so much an issue, they've got the building, they've got all the public utilities that are there, is there another common error or misjudgment that you find in more developed countries and cities and places throughout the United States where they have errors and issues?
Absolutely. So probably the top two have to do with selecting the head grower and selecting the genetics. So with regards to the head grower, this is arguably the most important position inside of a cultivation business. So really the success or failure of the business really rests on the shoulders of the person ultimately in charge of the cultivation program. And so what I found is that people new to the industry typically hire for cannabis knowledge, not necessarily plant production experience. And so what happens is these folks end up hiring someone that knows a lot about cannabis, knows a lot about the culture and the plant and the varieties. They know when to harvest, they know how to cure the product. But what they don't have are things like people management skills, facility management skills, the ability to plan production. And so what happens is the company has to learn about commercial plant production at the same pace as the grower. And what happens is this is a very long and expensive learning curve, and the business is the one that foots the bill. So hiring an inexperienced or inappropriate head grower is probably one of the biggest oversights in the US. And the second one is launching with too many genetics. Typically, it's human nature to think, more is better. But on a commercial scale, what growers try to do is treat all of the plants the same. When you start growing dozens and dozens of different varieties, especially for a startup, you really overcomplicate the process. And oftentimes the cultivation program implodes because any startup in the industry really isn't pretty. There's a lot of challenges, a lot of things that happen you really couldn't anticipate. And so what we try to do from a growing perspective is eliminate the unknowns on the growing side. So if you have a new facility, a new grower, new regulations, and you, on top of that, throw in 30 different varieties to start, very few growers could handle that. So next to hiring an inexperienced head grower, really starting with too many genetics is a common mistake I see a lot of companies in the U.S. make.
Well, I find that very interesting that you're talking about the genetics, because it's one thing we see so much of with cultivators here in the U.S. is just this incredible variety. But I've always wondered what kind of complications that creates for the grower themselves when you've got so much variety. Have you found in the years that you've been in this, clearly there's particular genetics and certain strains that are they're just popular with consumers. They love them sort of no matter what. They're kind of the go-tos. Do you find that still to be the case?
Well, it's interesting. Every few months, there's a new hot variety. So if we look at adult use, recreational use states, what the consumer is looking for is pretty simple. It's usually high THC with a unique mix of terpenes. So it's the terpenes that create the flavor and the aroma of cannabis when it's consumed. And so the majority of recreational cannabis consumers go into a dispensary and immediately their eyes go to the THC level in the product. And so high THC would be anything that's 30% or above. So that's really rare, but those varieties that do offer 30% or more THC can command some of the highest prices. But besides the THC, people are also looking for something that's unique, a flavor or an aroma that hasn't been on the market recently. And so that's where we see a lot of exciting projects through breeding and crosses. I think when we look ahead into the next few years of adult use, those are going to be the varieties that are most in demand. Not necessarily the name, but what it contains, which is the active ingredient, the THC, and then the unique mix of terpenes, which will give it that special flavor or aroma.
Now, going back a moment to sort of operations and the master grower, what have you found with these cultivation and operations that get going? How long does it take for them to sort of realize that they've maybe headed down a long path? Like you've mentioned, there's quite a bit of a learning curve before they realize. Is there sort of a time frame that you've discovered where operationally they realize, oops, we messed up? Are they a year into it before those kind of revelations come to light?
So I think it comes down to the size of the facility that they've been hired to manage. So if they're growing a couple dozen plants at home, in their closet or in their basement or outdoors, and then they're hired to run a facility that's 50,000 square feet. That's a massive jump. So absolutely, if they're not prepared, they're going to recognize immediately that they've bitten off more than they can chew. So what I tell clients that come to me looking for advice on how to find the right head grower is typically I say, look for someone that has 10 years of experience in commercial plant production, not necessarily with cannabis, but growing anything. And I say that because in the intro, you mentioned that my background actually is traditional horticulture. So for a decade and a half, I was growing ornamental crops and edible crops on a commercial scale across the U.S. And that was a priceless learning experience. It really helped position me well to become a commercial cannabis grower because probably 90% of the techniques and the concepts used to grow ornamental crops or edible crops commercially, they transfer directly to cannabis. So what we find more and more, because there's more and more states that have legal cannabis cultivation, there's fewer and fewer experienced cannabis growers. So they're in really high demand. And, besides really stealing somebody from your competition, what I recommend clients do is actually turn to traditional horticulture, where I came from. And if you can identify someone that has been growing commercially for 10 years, they're in an excellent position to really help launch your business because they already are familiar with the concepts of production planning and people management and facility management. And it's just a matter of really training them through a cultivation consultant or a cannabis expert, really the idiosyncrasies, the specifics of cannabis. And that right there, in my experience, is really a recipe for success. You pull a grower from traditional horticulture, you supplement their knowledge with cannabis-specific expertise, and you're off to the races.
So I hear what you're saying with that recipe for success. Is there sort of a sweet spot for most growers in terms of the size of the operation, the amount of the square footage, where it's manageable for sort of just the greatest percentage of startups that are out there?
The number I would have suggested is 10,000 square feet to 20,000 square feet is an excellent starting point for new licensees and for growers that are either coming from the illicit or caregiver market. So they have experience growing cannabis, but not on a large scale. And for companies that are new to cannabis. So it's an excellent starting point. 10,000 square feet that's run successfully will produce a lot of cannabis. But anything beyond 20,000 square feet, you really want to make sure that you have your ducks in a row in the sense that your head grower and your cultivation team know what they're doing, because otherwise it's going to be a very expensive learning curve. And I've seen numerous companies really stumble and overcomplicate the process before they can even harvest 1 gram of cannabis. And that's not only costly, but it's embarrassing. If you have a company that has raised millions of dollars, made promises not only to investors and to the regulators that issue the license, but also to the consumers that are anxiously waiting the opportunity to legally purchase cannabis. If you start growing and you have multiple crop failures, it's possible that you could go months without ever having any product to sell. So 10,000 square feet, I think, is safe. 20,000 square feet if you're feeling confident. But beyond that, you really need to make sure that you have an experienced grower that knows what they're doing in order to pull it off.
I've seen some photos of you doing inspection. What are you looking for? I notice you have a loop out and you're obviously magnifying and taking a closer look at the cannabis buds somewhere through the growing process. And I would imagine you're doing that at certain stages throughout. But what do you look for when you're inspecting a plant up close?
So this is a process that we call scouting, and this is something that growers do, if not daily, at least once a week. And it's simply a process of walking the crop and looking for any anomalies in production. So basically, we're looking for early signs of insect infestations or disease infestations or perhaps nutritional problems in the crop. So with regards to insect and disease, as cannabis growers, we are prohibited from using any chemicals in terms of pesticides or fungicides, especially during the flowering phase. So that's a luxury that ornamental growers have that cannabis growers don't have. So if your growing poinsettias in a couple weeks before Christmas, you get an insect infestation, there's a number of different products you could apply. It's going to kill the insects and the plant will be saleable. But if that happens in cannabis, oftentimes it will result in a crop failure because once an infestation occurs, there's very few products we could apply to the plant to fix the problem. So the reason we scout is it's really a preventative measure. We try to catch things before they really blow out of control. So, for example, if we're scouting the crop for insects and we find a few insects on a few leaves, we could either apply an organic-based pesticide, which is totally natural, and it could help decrease the risk of a greater infestation, or we could choose to implement beneficial insect program. And these are basically predatory insects, really good bugs we release on the crop that search for the plant damaging bugs, and they eat them before they have a chance to damage the crop. So when you mention inspecting, it's really scouting, it's really investigating for the very first signs of any potential problem in the crop, so we can catch it early, correct it before it results in a costly crop failure.
If you could say, and just to summarize, what would be the 3 to 5 top tips that you would recommend for any startup cultivator, could you re-summarize those?
Let's see, I always like to think in terms of the 3 Gs. So I know I touched on it briefly before, but it's genetics, grower, and greenhouse. So start with only a handful of genetics. Typically for startups, I recommend no more than 5 to 10 at a maximum. And once production is rolling, once the company begins to realize revenue, they have demand for their product, then it would be an appropriate time to introduce new varieties or trial new varieties. And at that point, you could really switch out existing varieties quickly. But if we start with more than 5 or 10 varieties, we really set ourselves up for failure. We increase the chance of overcomplicating the process. So that would be one of my first recommendations, one of my first tips. Second is grower, just to recap. Don't necessarily concentrate on cannabis-specific expertise, but look for commercial plant production experience. That's going to go a long ways in helping to ensure that you realize a smooth startup and that your grower doesn't make elementary basic mistakes that any grower should learn in the beginning of their career. And the third, which we haven't spoken about yet, is designing a facility that works. And so when I say works, I mean when we think about an indoor facility or a greenhouse, these structures exist to create the ideal growing, the optimal growing parameters for a plant. So that is everything from light intensity to carbon dioxide levels, temperature, humidity, airflow. And so oftentimes I've seen that in an attempt to save capital expenditures, companies will design their own facility in-house. So maybe they'll have an engineer or just somebody really smart on the team, and they'll put them in charge of putting together a grow room or designing a greenhouse. And what happens is on the front end, they'll save a lot of money, but on the back end, they'll end up spending 30 times that amount trying to retrofit and fix the problems they created. So one of the biggest tips I give startups is to really hire an expert at the get-go, someone that has designed indoor production facilities or has designed greenhouses before, so that perhaps it's a little bit more expensive on the front side, but for the following years, you really don't need to worry about a facility that won't hold the optimum growing parameters for the plant.
Let's talk a little bit about the future of cultivation and where do you see it going?
Sure. So I think growers are going to come under increased pressure to minimize their carbon footprint in the future. So on the one hand, it's great that more and more states and more countries are legalizing cannabis. But as a result, that means there's more and more cultivation. So what we don't want to leave as our legacy is really an industry that consumes, an unfathomable amount of electricity in order to produce what it is that we sell. So when we look ahead to the future, I believe that growers will come under increased pressure to really monitor or regulate the amount of electricity they use and the amount of water they use. So I think as we move forward, we're going to see more and more growers, new companies, launching production using greenhouses as opposed to indoor grow operations, because indoor growing is the most expensive way to build a facility, and it's also the most expensive way to operate a facility. So in really hot markets, that can be justified by the price point they earn at retail. But, if you think about it, for anyone that hasn't seen an indoor grow room, they're filled with lights. Probably half of the energy that comes out of a grow light comes out in the form of heat. So they consume a lot of electricity, but they also require a lot of electricity in order to basically air condition that room to evacuate the heat. So these indoor grow facilities are really hogs when it comes to energy. And so I believe that we need to be responsible and anticipate that we're not always going to be allowed to grow this way, because if we look at any other commercially grown crop, cannabis is the only one that we grow indoors. And so every other crop, whether it's a fruit or flower or vegetable or herb, it's being grown outdoors in greenhouses successfully. So if growers can do that with basil or tomatoes, we can certainly do it with cannabis. So when we look ahead to the future, I think we're going to see more greenhouse production. And in terms of indoor production, I think we're going to see more and more equipment that allows growers to do what they do, but consume less electricity. So it'll be something like more efficient grow lights, perhaps, or irrigation systems, the use of sensors and technology that allow us to use or at least waste less water each time we irrigate our plants.
Yeah, and just being more aware of the environment. Is your book available now?
Yes, people can find the paperback and the Kindle version on Amazon.
Excellent. If someone wanted to reach you for more information, is there an email or a website where you can be reached?
Sure, I can be reached through my website. It's douglascultivation.com. Folks can reach out to me there. I also have a number of free resources. I contribute to my blog 3 times a week, and I'm posting newsletters, etc. So there's a lot of free information available. But there's also a way to contact me directly through my contact page.
Fantastic. So, folks, we've heard from Ryan Douglas some incredible information through his years of knowledge and expertise in cultivation, and his book, From Seed to Success, providing advice and checklists and templates for cannabis entrepreneurs so that they can avoid the costly startup mistakes that often happen with growing operations. And so I highly recommend that you seek out Ryan Douglas and his book for more information. Ryan, it's been a pleasure having you today. Learned a lot of interesting things about cultivation, and your background is clearly impressive. And I was just fascinated by the connection of commercial horticultural work and its relevance here in cannabis, because I think that's an important thing that doesn't seem initially obvious, but absolutely is when we think about how the need for cannabis to be really prepared for and thought of as any commercial crop with all of those demands that any business in that field would have. And to have a thriving cultivation business and to be able to avoid those problems and have good management practices are essential.
I really appreciate you having me on the show, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak about exactly that topic.
Well, Ryan, thank you again. This is Collective Wisdom. I'm your host, Lisa Tollner. Thank you so much for joining us, and be well.
That's this week's episode of the Collective Wisdom Podcast. Join us each week for another episode on OC Talk Radio, streaming on Thursdays at 3 p.m., and you can download Collective Wisdom wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to visit cacollectivewisdom.com or email us at collectivewisdompodcast@gmail.com to join the conversation. Thank you for listening.